I never thought a pair of insulated gloves would lead to someone losing their fingers, but that's exactly what happened in the Cedar Grove Homeowners Association last winter. And honestly, I'm still processing the whole nightmare. My name is Keith Patterson, and I'd lived in Cedar Grove, Minnesota, for about 3 years before everything went sideways. It's one of those suburban developments outside Minneapolis where every house looks almost identical. The lawns are mandatory perfection, and the HOA rules are thicker than a phone book. I'm a construction project manager, so I'm outside in all kinds of weather, which is why I invested in a really expensive pair of Arctic-grade insulated gloves. They cost me $200, but when you're dealing with Minnesota winters where it drops to -20, you don't mess around with cheap equipment. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late January. I'd left my gloves in my truck overnight, which I normally don't do, but I'd been exhausted after a 14-hour shift dealing with a commercial project deadline. I walked out to my driveway at 6 in the morning, coffee in hand, ready to head to the job site, and noticed my truck's passenger door was slightly ajar. My heart sank immediately because I knew I'd locked it the night before. I pulled the door open and checked inside. Nothing major seemed missing at first. My registration was still in the glove compartment. The spare change in the cup holder hadn't been touched, but my gloves were gone. Those beautiful, warm, life-saving gloves that had gotten me through 2 brutal Minnesota winters were just gone. I stood there in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, my breath forming clouds in the air, absolutely furious. That's when I noticed her. Brenda Morrison, the HOA president, was standing in her driveway 3 houses down, loading something into her car. She was a 52-year-old woman with that distinctive haircut that screams, "I'd like to speak to your manager," wearing a puffy jacket that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. Brenda had been a thorn in my side since I moved in, constantly sending violation notices for things like my trash cans being visible from the street 15 minutes past collection time or my grass being a 1/4 inch too long. I didn't think much of seeing her there that morning. I was more focused on the fact that someone had broken into my truck. I went back inside and called the non-emergency police line to report the theft. They said they'd send an officer by later that day to take a report, which in small-town Minnesota basically meant, "We'll get to it when we get to it." Work that day was miserable. The temperature had dropped to -15, and without my proper gloves, I was stuck wearing a cheap backup pair that barely kept my fingers from going numb. Every time I had to handle metal tools or touch anything outside, I felt the cold bite right through the thin insulation. My crew kept asking if I was okay because I was clearly struggling, and I had to explain the situation about 5 times. When I got home that evening around 7, there was a notice stuck to my front door. It was printed on the official Cedar Grove HOA letterhead, and my stomach dropped before I even read it. The notice stated that my truck had been parked in violation of community standards because it was left unsecured with the door open, creating an eyesore and security risk for the neighborhood. The fine was $150. I stood there reading this absurd notice in the glow of my porch light, the cold seeping through my inadequate gloves, and felt my blood pressure skyrocket. Not only had someone stolen from my truck, but now I was being fined for being the victim of a crime. The notice was signed by Brenda Morrison in her flowing, self-important signature. I immediately walked down to Brenda's house. Her home was the largest in the development, a 2-story colonial with decorative shutters and a front yard that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Every inch of her property was meticulously maintained, probably to set an example for the rest of us peasants. I rang her doorbell, trying to keep my temper in check. She answered after a moment, still wearing her expensive jacket even though she was clearly inside her heated home. "Keith," she said, my name coming out like she'd tasted something sour. "What can I do for you? You can explain this ridiculous fine," I said, holding up the notice. "Someone broke into my truck last night and stole my property, and now you're fining me for it." Brenda's expression didn't change. She had this ability to look down her nose at you even if you were taller than her, which I was by a good 6 inches. The HOA bylaws are very clear. Section 12, Paragraph 4 states that all vehicles must be properly secured when parked in driveways. Your truck door was open this morning, which violates that rule. "Because someone broke into it," I said, speaking slowly like I was explaining something to a child. "I filed a police report. I'm the victim here." "The circumstances don't change the violation," she said primly. "If you'd like to contest the fine, you can submit a written appeal to the HOA board, and we'll review it at our next quarterly meeting in March." "March? That's 6 weeks away. Those are the procedures, Keith. I don't make the rules, I just enforce them." She started to close the door, but I put my hand against it. "Did you see anything last night? Anyone suspicious in the neighborhood?" Something flickered across her face just for a second. It was too quick to identify, but it was definitely there. "No," she said flatly. "I didn't see anything. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have dinner getting cold." She closed the door in my face, and I stood there on her perfect welcome mat, absolutely seething. I walked back to my house, my fingers aching from the cold even in the short distance, and spent the rest of the evening fuming about the injustice of it all. The next morning, I stopped by the hardware store before work and bought another pair of insulated gloves. They weren't as good as my stolen ones, but they were $90 and would have to do. The cashier, an older guy named Tom who I'd chatted with before, noticed I was buying the same type I'd purchased from him 2 months earlier. "Lose the other pair?" he asked. "Stolen," I said. "Someone broke into my truck." He shook his head sympathetically. "That's the third person this week who's mentioned thefts in Cedar Grove. Someone said their snow shovel went missing, and another lady lost some packages off her porch. That caught my attention." "Really? Did they report it to the police?" "I think so, but you know how it is. Small stuff like that doesn't usually lead anywhere." He bagged my gloves and wished me luck. I thought about that conversation all day. Multiple thefts in the neighborhood, and Brenda hadn't mentioned anything about it when I'd asked if she'd seen anything suspicious. As HOA president, wouldn't that be something she'd want to address? Unless she already knew exactly what was happening. Over the next week, I kept my eyes open. I started paying attention to the neighborhood patterns, who was where and when. Brenda was always out early in the morning, usually around the time I was leaving for work. She'd be checking her mailbox or loading things into her car, or just standing in her driveway like she was surveying her domain. It struck me as odd because most people aren't that active at 6 in the morning in the middle of winter, especially someone who didn't have a regular job to get to. Then, 8 days after my gloves were stolen, I saw something that made everything click into place. It was another brutally cold morning, -18 with a wind chill that made it feel like -30. I was in my truck, letting it warm up, when I saw Brenda come out of her house. She was wearing my gloves. I recognized them immediately, because they had a distinctive orange reflective strip on the back that I'd added myself for visibility on the job site. They were absolutely, unmistakably my gloves. I sat there in my idling truck, watching her as she walked to her mailbox wearing my stolen property, and I felt this cold rage settle over me. She opened her mailbox, pulled out some envelopes, and walked back inside. my gloves protecting her hands the entire time. I waited until I saw her leave about an hour later, her car pulling out of the driveway headed toward the main road. Then I went home and called the police again. This time, I asked specifically for the officer who'd taken my initial report, a young guy named Officer Stevens. He came by that afternoon and I explained what I'd seen. "I know who stole my gloves," I said. "It's the HOA president, Brenda Morrison. I saw her wearing them this morning." Officer Stevens looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Patterson, that's a serious accusation." "Are you absolutely certain they were your gloves?" "Positive. They have an orange reflective strip," I added myself. "Custom modification." He wrote some notes in his little pad. "The thing is, even if they are your gloves, she could claim she bought them somewhere or found them. Without proof of the actual theft, it's difficult to pursue charges. So she can just steal from me and nothing happens." "I'm not saying that. I'm saying we need evidence. Has anything else been stolen from your property?" "No, just the gloves." "But other people in the neighborhood have reported thefts too." His expression shifted slightly. "Really? Who?" I told him what Tom at the hardware store had said. Officer Stevens made more notes and said he'd look into it. He also said he'd have a conversation with Brenda about the gloves, but he couldn't make any promises about getting them back or filing charges without more evidence. After he left, I felt frustrated but at least somewhat validated. Someone official now knew what was happening, even if they couldn't do much about it immediately. That evening, Brenda showed up at my door. Her face was red, whether from cold or anger I couldn't tell. "How dare you send the police to my house?" she hissed the moment I opened the door. "How dare you steal my gloves?" I shot back. "I didn't steal anything. These gloves were in the neighborhood donation box. That stopped me." "What donation box?" "The one by the mailboxes at the community entrance. Someone left them there 2 weeks ago, and I took them because I needed new gloves." Her voice had that shrill quality that certain angry people get when they're either lying or convinced of their own righteousness. 2 weeks ago. "Brenda, they were stolen from my truck 8 days ago. And there's no donation box at the entrance." "There most certainly is. It's been there for months." I knew for a fact there was no donation box because I drove past that entrance twice a day, but arguing wasn't going to get anywhere. "Fine. Give me back the gloves and we'll call it even." "No. I found them fair and square." "You found stolen property. That's called receiving stolen goods, Brenda." Her face went even redder. "You're going to regret this, Keith. I'm calling an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss your harassment of board members. This kind of behavior is not acceptable in Cedar Grove." She stormed off before I could respond, leaving me standing in my doorway wondering how my life had become so absurd. I was being threatened with HOA action because I'd accused someone of stealing my property after literally seeing them wear it. The next day, I got another notice. This one informed me that an emergency HOA board meeting had been scheduled for that Saturday to discuss ongoing violations and conduct issues with my property. The way it was worded made it sound like I was the neighborhood criminal. I called my buddy Marcus, who's a lawyer, and explained the situation. He laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "Man, HOA drama is the best drama," he said once he'd caught his breath. "Okay, here's what you do. Document everything. Take pictures of your truck, pictures of her wearing the gloves if you can get them. Print out all the notices she's sent you. If this meeting is about you, you have a right to defend yourself, and you want evidence." I spent the next few days doing exactly that. I set up my phone on a dashboard mount in my truck and recorded her walking to her mailbox wearing my gloves 2 more times. The orange reflective strip was clearly visible in both videos. I also drove to the neighborhood entrance and took pictures showing there was definitely no donation box anywhere near the mailboxes. Saturday came with another vicious cold snap. The forecast said -22, which is the kind of cold that hurts your face within minutes of exposure. I bundled up in layers and headed to the community center at the scheduled time of 10 in the morning. The Cedar Grove Community Center was a small building near the neighborhood park, mostly used for HOA meetings and the occasional birthday party. When I arrived, the parking lot was surprisingly full. Apparently, word had spread about the meeting and people were curious about the drama. Inside, the main room had been set up with a table at the front for the board members and rows of folding chairs for residents. Brenda sat in the middle of the table with 4 other board members flanking her. I recognized them all. Gary Henderson, a retired accountant who always looked half asleep. Patricia Thompson, a real estate agent who thought she was better than everyone. Robert Chen, an engineer who seemed reasonable but always deferred to Brenda. And Susan Williams, a teacher who I'd barely ever spoken to. About 30 residents had shown up, which was a lot for Cedar Grove. Most HOA meetings barely got 10 people. Everyone was bundled in winter coats because the community center's heating was mediocre at best. Brenda called the meeting to order by banging a gavel on the table like she was a judge. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she said, her voice carrying that fake pleasant tone that fooled absolutely no one. "We've called this emergency meeting to address serious concerns about a resident who has been violating multiple community standards and has recently begun harassing board members." She didn't say my name, but everyone in the room turned to look at me. I sat in the front row, my folder of evidence on my lap, and stared right back at Brenda. She went through a list of my supposed violations. The trash can incident from 6 months ago. The grass height issue from last summer. A complaint that my truck was too commercial looking for a residential neighborhood, even though it was just a regular pickup. She made it sound like I was running a meth lab out of my garage instead of just living my normal life. Then she got to the recent issues. And most disturbingly, this resident has made false accusations against me personally, claiming that I stole his property. He went so far as to send the police to my home, wasting taxpayer resources and causing me significant emotional distress. "They're not false accusations," I said loudly. "You're wearing my stolen gloves right now." The room went silent. Everyone looked at Brenda's hands, which were indeed covered by my distinctive gloves. She quickly pulled them off and put them in her lap under the table. "These gloves were donated," she snapped. "I've already explained this to you. There's no donation box, Brenda. I have pictures." I pulled out my phone and held up a photo of the entrance area. "This was taken yesterday. No box." Gary Henderson leaned over to whisper something to Brenda. She shook her head sharply. "The box was removed for the winter," she said. "It'll be back in spring." "Convenient timing," I said. "Those gloves were stolen from my truck on January 22nd. I filed a police report. You've been wearing them ever since, and they have a custom orange reflective strip that I added myself." "Want to show everyone the back of those gloves?" Brenda's face had gone from red to pale. Patricia Thompson spoke up. "Perhaps we should move on to other business. This seems like a personal dispute that should be handled outside the HOA." "No," I said, standing up. "You called this emergency meeting to publicly attack me for reporting a theft. Let's actually talk about what's happening in this neighborhood. There have been multiple thefts lately. Has the board addressed that? Have you warned residents? Or have you been too busy fining victims for being victimized?" Robert Chen cleared his throat. "Mr. Patterson, We weren't aware of multiple thefts. If you have information, we should hear it." I explained what Tom at the hardware store had told me about other residents reporting stolen items. "Someone's been taking things from driveways and porches. My gloves were taken from my locked truck, and now the HOA president is wearing them." The room erupted in murmuring. Several people started talking at once, mentioning things that'd go missing. One woman said her garden tools had disappeared from her shed. Another mentioned packages that never arrived even though tracking said they'd been delivered. Brenda banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! This is not productive." Mr. Patterson is trying to deflect from his own violations by making wild accusations. "Show us the gloves," someone called from the back. "If they don't have the orange strip, you're in the clear." Brenda clutched the gloves tighter in her lap. "I don't have to prove anything to you people. This is my property." "Then you won't mind if we call the police right now," I said, pulling out my phone. "Let them settle it." That's when Brenda made a mistake. She stood up abruptly, the gloves falling from her lap to the floor, and said, "This meeting is over. Everyone needs to leave. Now." But the gloves were now visible on the floor, and the orange reflective strip was clearly showing. My neighbor from 2 doors down, a woman named Helen who I'd helped with yard work a few times, pointed at them. "Those do have an orange strip. Keith, are those really yours?" "Yes," I said firmly. "And I have video of her wearing them, plus my original receipt from the hardware store with the serial number that matches those gloves." I actually didn't have the receipt anymore, but Brenda didn't know that, and the bluff worked. Her expression crumbled from righteous anger to something closer to panic. She grabbed the gloves from the floor and clutched them to her chest. "You can't prove anything." Gary Henderson stood up slowly. "Brenda, maybe you should just give the man his gloves back. This has gotten out of hand." "No, he's been violating community standards for years. Someone had to do something." The room went very quiet. Susan Williams leaned forward. "Brenda, what do you mean someone had to do something? What did you do?" And that's when it all fell apart for her. The stress, the accusation, the public confrontation, it all became too much, and Brenda Morrison, the HOA president who'd made my life miserable for 3 years, broke down. "He deserved it. All of you who don't follow the rules, who make this neighborhood look trashy, you all deserve it. I've worked so hard to keep property values up, to maintain standards, and none of you appreciate it." "So you did steal the gloves," I said quietly. She looked at me with wild eyes. "You left your truck unlocked. It was practically an invitation. And you were getting away with parking that eyesore in your driveway every single day, making the whole street look like a construction zone. My truck was locked. You broke into it." "I did not. The door was open." "Because you opened it, Brenda." The other board members were staring at her in horror. Patricia stood up and physically moved away from the table. "Brenda, are you saying you've been stealing from residents?" "Not stealing, collecting, confiscating items from people who violate the rules. It's enforcement." The room exploded. Everyone was shouting at once. Someone was already on their phone, probably calling the police. Helen was demanding to know if Brenda had taken her garden tools. Another man was yelling about his stolen snow blower. I just stood there, watching Brenda's complete meltdown, feeling a mix of vindication and genuine shock. I thought she was just a petty tyrant who enjoyed enforcing stupid rules. I hadn't realized she'd gone completely off the deep end and decided she was some kind of neighborhood vigilante with the right to take people's property. The police arrived about 10 minutes later. Officer Stevens walked in with an older officer I didn't recognize, and the room slowly quieted down. Brenda was sitting in her chair now, crying, the gloves still clutched in her hands. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of what she'd done had physically shrunk her, Officer Stevens approached me first. "Mr. Patterson, what's going on here?" I explained the situation as calmly as I could, gesturing to the gloves and mentioning the video evidence I had on my phone. The older officer, whose badge said Martinez, went over to talk to Brenda while Stevens took my statement. What happened over the next hour was surreal. Brenda eventually admitted to taking my gloves, but she insisted it was justified because I'd been violating community standards. When pressed about other thefts, she initially denied involvement, then gradually admitted she might have relocated a few items to teach people lessons about following the rules. The garden tools were in her garage because the owner had left them visible in her yard. The packages were in her basement because they'd been sitting on porches for more than 24 hours, which was unsightly. Officer Martinez asked if she had a key or access to other properties. Brenda, still crying, explained that as HOA president, she'd made copies of common area keys years ago, and some of those keys happened to work on certain residents' gates and sheds because the builder had used standard locks throughout the development. The more she talked, the worse it got. She'd been taking things for almost 8 months, ever since the HOA board had rejected her proposal to increase fines for violations. In her mind, if the association wouldn't back her up with serious financial penalties, she'd enforce compliance her own way. She justified it as temporary confiscation until residents proved they could follow the rules, at which point she planned to return the items. Of course, no one had ever gotten their stuff back because Brenda's standards were impossible to meet. The hardware store guy had been right. There had been multiple thefts, all committed by the same person, all justified in that person's twisted logic as necessary for the good of the community. Officer Martinez placed Brenda under arrest for theft and burglary. As they led her out in handcuffs, still crying, still trying to explain how she was the real victim because no one appreciated her dedication to the neighborhood, I felt the strangest mix of emotions. Relief that I'd been proven right, anger at everything she'd put people through, and a tiny bit of pity for someone who'd become so obsessed with control that she'd destroyed her own life. The HOA meeting obviously never resumed. The remaining board members stood around in shock, whispering to each other about legal liability and their insurance policy, and whether they needed to hire a lawyer. Residents clustered in groups, sharing stories about things they thought they'd lost to random theft, but now realized had been Brenda. I got my gloves back. Officer Stevens put them in an evidence bag first, but he said I'd be able to retrieve them once they'd been photographed and logged. The serial number I'd bluffed about didn't actually matter because Brenda had confessed. Helen came up to me as I was leaving. "Thank you for standing up to her. I've been terrified of that woman for 5 years. I just wanted my gloves back," I said honestly. "I didn't expect all this. Still, you did the right thing." I went home and tried to process what had just happened. My quiet Saturday morning had turned into a complete circus, and the neighborhood's all-powerful HOA president was in jail for theft. It felt like something from a bad reality TV show, except it was my actual life. The real surprise came the next day. Sunday afternoon, I was watching a Vikings game when someone knocked on my door. It was Officer Martinez, the older cop from yesterday's arrest. He looked serious, which immediately made me nervous. "Mr. Patterson, can I come in for a minute?" "Sure, of course." I let him in and muted the game. "Is this about Brenda, in a way? We executed a search warrant on her property this morning. We found a lot of stolen items. Garden tools, packages, decorative yard ornaments, even someone's mailbox. But we also found something concerning, and I need to ask you about it." My stomach dropped. "Okay, Did you have any direct confrontations with Miss Morrison in the last 2 weeks besides the incident at your door and the HOA meeting? No, not really. I saw her around, but we didn't talk. Did you ever threaten her or make her feel unsafe? What? No, why? Officer Martinez pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. It was a notebook page covered in handwriting, Brenda's distinctive flowing script. The page was titled Patterson Violations Log and included dates, times, and detailed descriptions of supposed rule violations going back 3 years. Every minor infraction, real or imagined, was meticulously documented. That's creepy, but not really surprising given yesterday, I said. He swiped to another photo. This page was more recent, dated from the last 2 weeks. The notes were different, more frantic. Subject continues to harass and stalk me, feels threatening, may need to take protective action, cannot let violations continue, must maintain order. Consider extreme measures. I stared at the phone screen, cold settling into my gut. Extreme measures, what does that mean? We're not sure. But combined with the theft escalation and her mental state at the time of arrest, we're concerned about what she might have been planning. Were you aware she was monitoring your schedule? I mean, we're neighbors. She sees when I come and go, but monitoring? No. He showed me another page. This one had my work schedule written out in detail, including job site addresses, approximate times I left and returned home, and notes about which vehicle I drove on which days. It was comprehensive and deeply disturbing. How did she get this information? Best we can figure, she was following you sometimes and checking your social media. You posted about a project deadline a few weeks ago. I thought back to a Facebook post I'd made complaining about long hours. I never mentioned specific locations or times. She filled in the gaps somehow. Mr. Patterson, I'm telling you this because you should be aware of the situation. Miss Morrison has been released on bail with conditions that she stay away from you and the Cedar Grove neighborhood, but given her obsessive behavior and these notes about extreme measures, I want you to be careful. If you see her anywhere near your property or workplace, call us immediately. After he left, I sat on my couch for a long time, the muted football game playing to an empty room. The vindication I'd felt yesterday was gone, replaced by the creeping realization that the situation had been potentially much worse than I'd understood. Brenda hadn't just been a petty thief enforcing stupid HOA rules. She'd been fixated on me specifically, documenting my life, planning something she called extreme measures. I called Marcus again. When I told him about the notebook, his laughter from our previous conversation was completely absent. Keith, man, you need to take this seriously. Get security cameras. Document everything. If she violated the restraining order conditions, she goes back to jail, but you need proof. That week, I installed cameras covering every angle of my property. Front door, back door, driveway, the whole perimeter. I felt ridiculous, like I was preparing for a siege, but the notebook photos kept replaying in my mind. What were extreme measures in the mind of someone who thought stealing people's belongings was justified? The neighborhood was in chaos. The HOA board called another emergency meeting, this time to discuss Brenda's removal as president and to address the legal fallout. I didn't attend, but Helen filled me in later. Patricia Thompson had taken over as interim president, and their insurance company was having a field day with the liability claims from residents who'd had items stolen. Brenda's personal homeowner's insurance might cover some of it, but the legal mess would take months to untangle. Several residents had filed police reports about their stolen items. The district attorney was building a case that included multiple counts of theft, burglary, and something about abuse of authority. Brenda was looking at potential jail time, not just fines. Through all of this, I kept working, kept living my life, kept checking my security cameras obsessively. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2 weeks. February arrived with even colder temperatures, the kind of brutal stretch where it doesn't get above 0 for days at a time. That's when the temperature hit -30 with a wind chill of -50. Minnesota winters are harsh, but this was extreme even for us. The news was warning people not to go outside unless absolutely necessary. Exposed skin could get frostbite in under 5 minutes. It was legitimately dangerous to be outdoors. I was home that day because my job site had shut down. No one works construction in -30. I was drinking hot coffee and watching the news warn about the cold for the 100th time when my security camera alert went off. Someone was in my driveway. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone, and my blood ran cold for reasons that had nothing to do with the temperature. Brenda Morrison was standing next to my truck, wearing inadequate clothing for the conditions. She had on a light jacket, regular pants, and on her hands were my stolen gloves, the ones the police were supposed to have in evidence. I immediately called the police, reported her presence, and told them she was violating her release conditions. Then I watched the camera feed, phone in hand, not sure what to do. She was just standing there, swaying slightly, looking at my house. The temperature reading on my outdoor thermometer said -32. The rational part of my brain said to stay inside, wait for the police, let them handle it. But another part, the part that couldn't watch someone literally freeze to death in my driveway even if that person had stolen from me and potentially planned worse, made me grab my coat and head for the door. I opened it and called out to her. "Brenda, you need to leave. The police are coming." She turned to look at me. Her face was red and blotchy, her eyes wild. "This is your fault," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Everything was fine until you showed up with your violations and your refusal to follow simple rules. You need to get inside somewhere. It's -30. You're going to freeze. Good. Maybe then you'll understand what you've done to me. I've lost everything. My position, my reputation, my purpose." She started walking toward me, stumbling slightly. I backed up instinctively, not wanting her near me but also not wanting to close the door and leave her outside. "Brenda, you stole from people. You broke into my truck. You brought this on yourself." I was protecting the neighborhood, maintaining standards. You people never appreciated it. Her words were starting to slur slightly, which I knew was a sign of hypothermia setting in. "Take off the gloves," I said, focusing on something concrete. "Those are still evidence. You're making things worse." She looked down at her hands like she'd forgotten they were there. "These gloves. These stupid gloves that ruined my life." She pulled one off and threw it at me. It landed in the snow between us. Then she pulled off the other one and threw it too. That's when I realized how red her fingers were. Not just cold red, but a deeper, more alarming color. She'd been out in this weather for a while before coming to my house, and the gloves, while good, weren't designed for -30-degree weather while standing still. They were designed for active work where your body heat would supplement the insulation. "How long have you been outside?" I asked, genuine alarm cutting through my anger. "I don't know, who cares? I have nowhere to go, they took my house." That wasn't true. Her bail conditions just said she couldn't come to Cedar Grove, but she clearly wasn't thinking straight. Hypothermia does that. It messes with your brain, makes you irrational, makes you do stupid things like take off gloves in deadly cold. I grabbed my phone and called 911 directly, not the police line. "I need an ambulance at 847 Oak Ridge Drive in Cedar Grove." Woman with hypothermia, been outside in -30 for an unknown amount of time. She's disoriented. Brenda started crying, still standing in my driveway in the lethal cold. I just wanted people to follow the rules. Was that so wrong? Was that so terrible? Brenda, you need to come inside until the ambulance gets here. You're going to die out here. Good. But even as she said it, she took a stumbling step toward my open door, survival instinct fighting with whatever had driven her to my house in the first place. I helped her inside, careful not to touch her directly in case she tried something, and sat her in my entryway. Her fingers were an alarming shade of red-purple, and when she tried to flex them, she winced in pain. "I can't feel my hands," she said, her voice small and childlike, completely different from her usual authoritarian tone. The ambulance arrived before the police did, probably because the EMS were already out dealing with cold-related emergencies. They rushed in with their equipment, took one look at Brenda's hands, and started working immediately. One of them asked me what had happened, and I gave a quick explanation while they wrapped her in warming blankets and started in Roman 4. "How long was she exposed?" the EMT asked. "I don't know." "At least 20 minutes that I saw, but probably longer." He shook his head grimly. "Her fingers don't look good. This is serious frostbite." They loaded Brenda onto a stretcher and carried her out. She was crying softly, saying something about the gloves over and over. I picked up the thrown gloves from the snow and brought them inside, looking at them in the light. They were good gloves, well made, designed to protect hands in extreme conditions. But even the best gloves have limits, especially when someone's standing still in record-breaking cold while having a mental breakdown. The police arrived about 5 minutes after the ambulance left. Officer Stevens came in, took my statement, and collected the gloves as evidence again. He told me Brenda had apparently been living in her car since the bail conditions kicked in, parked at various locations around the greater Minneapolis area. She wasn't supposed to have those gloves at all. They should have been in the evidence locker, which meant she'd somehow taken them from the police station, or they'd been released to her by mistake. "We'll figure out what happened there," Stevens said, looking embarrassed. Regardless, showing up here was a direct violation of her release conditions. After they treat her at the hospital, she'll be taken into custody. After everyone left, I sat in my quiet house, processing everything. The vindication I'd sought, the justice I'd wanted, it all felt hollow. Yes, Brenda had stolen from me and others. Yes, she'd been obsessive and crossed serious lines. But watching her fall apart, watching her potentially lose her fingers to frostbite because she couldn't let go of her need to control the neighborhood, it was just sad. Over the next few days, pieces of the full story emerged. Helen told me that Patricia Thompson had mentioned Brenda was getting divorced, had been for about a year. Apparently her husband had left her because of her increasing obsession with the HOA and neighborhood compliance. Being HOA president had become her entire identity, her entire purpose, and when that was stripped away along with her marriage, she'd completely spiraled. I also learned from Officer Martinez that Brenda had indeed taken the gloves from the evidence room. Or rather, she'd taken them before they'd been officially logged into evidence. Some procedural confusion about whether they were being returned to me or held for the case meant they'd been sitting in a temporary holding area, and she'd accessed them during one of her court appearances when she'd been allowed to retrieve some personal items. The medical report eventually came through the legal system, shared with me because I'd been the one who called for the ambulance. Brenda had suffered severe frostbite on all 10 fingers. The doctors had tried warming protocols and medication to restore blood flow, but the damage was extensive. She'd lose parts of 3 fingers, maybe more depending on how things healed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She'd stolen my insulated gloves to enforce her idea of neighborhood order, then wore those same gloves while having a breakdown in deadly cold, and it wasn't enough to save her fingers. The criminal case moved forward. With the restraining order violation and the additional theft charges from other residents, Brenda's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. She'd serve 18 months in county jail, followed by probation and mandatory psychiatric treatment. The judge's statement during sentencing mentioned how her obsession had destroyed not just her life, but damaged the community she'd claimed to protect. I attended the sentencing hearing, not because I wanted to see her punished more, but because I wanted closure. Brenda looked different in her orange jail jumpsuit, her hands bandaged, her hair unstyled, her face devoid of that superior expression she'd always worn. When she gave her statement, she apologized, but it felt rehearsed, like her lawyer had written it for her. I'm not sure she truly understood what she'd done wrong, even after losing her position, her freedom, and parts of her fingers. The HOA situation took longer to resolve. Patricia Thompson turned out to be a much more reasonable president. She immediately revised the bylaws to limit board authority, require transparency in violations, and establish an appeal process that didn't take 6 weeks. The ridiculous fine against me was voided, along with several other questionable penalties Brenda had issued over the years. The stolen items were gradually returned to their owners as they were processed through evidence. I got my gloves back in March, once all the court proceedings were done. They felt different somehow, tainted by everything that had happened. I wore them a few more times, but eventually, I donated them to a homeless shelter. They were still good gloves, capable of protecting someone from the cold. They just always remind me of Brenda's face in the bitter winter darkness, crying about rules while her fingers turned purple. Marcus came over one evening after everything had settled, bringing beer and pizza. We sat in my living room and he shook his head in amazement. Man, I've heard some HOA horror stories, but this one takes the prize. Woman steals gloves, ends up losing her fingers to frostbite while wearing them. You can't make this stuff up. I feel bad for her, I admitted. I mean, not bad enough to forgive what she did, but still, she clearly needed help and instead of getting it, she just spiraled. That's not on you, Keith. You didn't make her steal things or show up at your house in deadly weather. She made those choices. I know. It's just weird to go from hating someone to pitying them so fast. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. People were friendlier, more willing to talk to each other now that the constant threat of HOA violations had been lifted. We still had rules, we still had standards, but they were enforced reasonably, with actual communication instead of surprise fines and midnight theft. Helen organized a neighborhood barbecue that summer, and almost everyone came. We'd all been through something together, bound by the shared trauma of living under Brenda's increasingly unstable regime. Someone made a joke about hiding the grilling tools before the HOA president showed up, and everyone laughed, but it was uncomfortable laughter. We all remembered. I kept the security cameras up. Even with Brenda in jail and eventually released to a halfway house nowhere near Cedar Grove, I felt better having that extra layer of security. Officer Martinez had been right when he'd told me to take the situation seriously. You never know what someone's capable of when they're fixated on something, when their entire identity becomes wrapped up in control. The gloves incident became a story I'd tell sometimes, usually when people asked about HOA horror stories or neighborhood drama. The reactions were always the same: disbelief, then shock, then a kind of morbid fascination that someone could become so obsessed with homeowner association rules that they'd commit crimes. But to me, it was never just a crazy story. It was a reminder of how easy it is for power, even tiny power like being an HOA president, to corrupt someone. How obsession can turn rational people irrational. How important it is to check your own behavior and make sure you're not crossing lines in the pursuit of what you think is right. Sometimes on cold winter mornings when I'm warming up my truck and putting on my gloves before heading to work, I think about Brenda. I wonder if she's okay, if she's gotten the mental health treatment she needed, if she's learned anything from what happened. I wonder if her fingers healed enough to be functional, or if she struggles with daily tasks now. A permanent reminder of the night she stood in my driveway crying about rules and violations while frostbite destroyed her hands. The HOA eventually hired a property management company to handle the day-to-day operations. No single person would have that much control again. It cost more, but everyone agreed it was worth it to avoid another situation like we'd had with Brenda. The management company was professional, fair, and most importantly, sane. I never moved away from Cedar Grove, though I considered it in the immediate aftermath of everything. My house was my home, and I wasn't going to let someone else's breakdown force me out. Plus, with the new HOA management, it was actually pleasant to live there. No more surprise fines. No more documented violations for having my trash cans visible for 20 minutes. Just a normal neighborhood where people followed reasonable rules and got along fine. The final piece of closure came about a year and a half after the initial incident. I received a letter, forwarded through the court system. It was from Brenda, handwritten in that same flowing script I'd seen in her violation logs, though shakier now. The letter was an apology, but unlike her courtroom statement, this one felt genuine. She wrote about her divorce, her depression, how being HOA president had become her way of feeling important and needed. She wrote about losing control of that role, about the escalating theft that she justified as confiscation in her mind. She wrote about standing in my driveway that night, so cold and so lost that death had seemed preferable to facing what her life had become. She described her time in jail, the therapy sessions, the slow realization of how far she'd fallen. She talked about her hands, the permanent damage, the daily struggle with tasks that used to be simple. She called it her penance, though she acknowledged that wasn't quite the right word since she hadn't chosen it. But she'd accepted it as a consequence of her actions. The letter ended with a simple request. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did, and I'm sorry. I hope you're doing well, and I hope the neighborhood is better without me. It probably is. I read that letter several times, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee trying to decide how I felt. Angry, sympathetic, vindicated, sad. All of those emotions swirled together in a complicated mix that had no easy answer. Eventually, I wrote back, keeping it brief. I acknowledged her apology, told her I hoped she was getting the help she needed, and wished her well in her recovery. I didn't say I forgave her because I wasn't sure I did, not completely. But I also didn't want to carry anger around forever. What happened had happened, and we both had to find ways to move forward. I never heard from her again after that. Sometimes I'd look her up online, checking to see if she'd moved back to the Minneapolis area or if there was any news about her. Nothing ever came up. She disappeared into whatever life she'd built after jail, after therapy, after losing her fingers and her identity as the enforcer of Cedar Grove standards. Life moved on as it does. I got promoted at work, started dating someone I met through friends, continued living in my house with its security cameras and its memories of that strange, sad winter. The HOA became just a thing I paid dues to, not a source of stress or conflict. Patricia Thompson retired as president after 2 years, and someone else took over, and the neighborhood continued to function just fine without Brenda's iron grip. But I never forgot the lesson of those insulated gloves. They were just gloves, ordinary protective equipment for Minnesota winters. Yet they'd become the center of a story about control, obsession, theft, and consequences. They'd literally cost someone their fingers, not because the gloves were dangerous, but because the person wearing them had been standing in deadly cold, having a breakdown fueled by inability to let go of power. On the coldest days, when the temperature drops below zero and the wind makes it feel even worse, I'm extra careful with my new gloves. I check them before leaving for work, make sure they're properly insulated, keep a spare pair in my truck just in case. Not just because I don't want frostbite, but because every time I put on winter gloves, I remember. I remember Brenda Morrison crying in my driveway, her hands already damaged by the cold, throwing my stolen gloves into the snow while screaming about violations and rules. I remember the EMTs shaking their heads over her purple fingers. I remember her in the courtroom, bandaged and broken, apologizing without really understanding why she needed to. And I remember that power, even small power, even HOA president power, can corrupt absolutely if you let it. That obsession can blind you to reality, make you justify terrible actions, drive you to stand in deadly cold pursuing some twisted sense of order and control. That things we think are important, rules and standards and neighborhood appearances, can become dangerous when they matter more than people. The gloves were just gloves, but they represented everything that went wrong when someone decided that being right, that enforcing compliance, that maintaining their version of order mattered more than basic human decency, more than respecting others' property, more than their own safety. I think about Brenda sometimes, wherever she is now, and I hope she learned that lesson too. I hope she found peace with what happened, found a new identity beyond being the enforcer, found ways to adapt to damaged hands and a damaged reputation. I hope she's okay. But mostly, I'm just glad it's over. Glad that I can come home to Cedar Grove without worrying about violation notices. Glad that my truck can sit in my driveway without being broken into by someone who thinks they're protecting property values. Glad that I can wear my gloves to work without them representing anything more than protection from the cold. That's all they should ever be. Just gloves. Just insulation. Just simple tools to keep Minnesota winters from destroying your hands. Nothing more complicated than that. Nothing more charged than that. Just gloves. But sometimes the simplest things become complicated. Sometimes a $200 pair of insulated gloves becomes the center of theft, obsession, police reports, court cases, frostbite, and permanent injury. Sometimes the smallest violation spirals into something no one could have predicted. I learned that winter. I learned it watching Brenda Morrison's complete breakdown. Watching her lose fingers to the same cold my stolen gloves were meant to protect against. Watching justice play out in ways both satisfying and tragic. And every winter since, when I pull on my gloves before heading out into the cold Minnesota morning, I'm grateful. Grateful for the warmth. Grateful for the protection. Grateful that they're just gloves, nothing more, nothing less. Just simple tools doing their job, keeping my hands safe while I go about my life in a neighborhood that's finally learned the difference between maintaining standards and maintaining humanity. That's the story of how an HOA Karen stole my insulated gloves, and I found her crying with frostbitten fingers later. It's not a happy story, but it's a real one. It happened in Cedar Grove, Minnesota, in the brutal winter of 2025, and it changed how I think about power, obsession, and the price people pay when they lose sight of what actually matters. The gloves were just the beginning. The consequences were everything that followed. And in the end, everyone lost something. Brenda lost her fingers, her freedom, and her identity. The neighborhood lost its sense of security. I lost my peace of mind, at least for a while, but we also gained something. Understanding, maybe. Perspective. A hard lesson about what happens when someone with even a little bit of power decides that rules matter more than people. That's a lesson worth learning, even if the cost was higher than anyone wanted to pay. Those gloves are long gone now, donated to someone who hopefully got good use from them without all the drama. But the memory remains, frozen in time like Brenda's fingers in that deadly cold, a permanent reminder of a winter when everything went wrong over something so simple, so ordinary, so everyday as a pair of insulated gloves.